Hey, give it up for our MC Spotlight. Woohoo! Awesome. I started calling it Spotlight. I know Jeff's still trying to name it, but if we just keep calling it Spotlight, Jeff won't need to name it. So he is allowing too much creative juices to be flown in this process. So I'm more of a control freak, and I like to just stick to MC Spotlight. So I'm going to invite up our two guests today so that these mics don't roll off the stools. You guys want to come up and take these? So this is Faye and Lisa. They're here representing VBJI. Can you guys give them a warm awaken welcome? If you guys want these at any point as well, they are yours. Hey, so we're talking this morning about a partnership that we have with VBJI. And so I'm going to move this so I don't sit on it. And I was just thinking this week, Jeff was actually supposed to be leading this interview. Yeah, he didn't want to talk to Faye, so I didn't want to bring that up awkwardly. But now that we're on stage. No, there's a stomach bug or something going around, so avoid the Riggs household and the Donahue household. It would be my advice to you, not only as your pastor, but as your friend right now. It's not pretty. But all joking aside, one of the things I was thinking about this week was how, and it's an awkward transition to go, but there's just so much stuff in the news right now as it pertains to sexuality. And you think about everything from, I think one of the real big for me, one of the first real big eye-opening experiences was I grew up watching a lot of older shows that my mom introduced me to. So guys like Bill Cosby was one of the ones I watched a lot growing up. And, that was my first real eye-opening experience to this darker undertone that we live in the world. And then Twitter hashtags get created, and then we get all into now we're seeing an entire, our national gymnastics board is now resigning due to everything that's happening in Michigan State. I mean, all these things are unfolding in our news every day with different parts of the story. And it's hard because part of me, and maybe you resonate with this as well, I just want to stick my head in the sand sometimes and just kind of do what I do, right? I go to work, I try to love my neighbor, I try and do the best I can. I got enough on that plate already to add something else to it. When I open my eyes and see the world around me, I'm like, Jesus, where are you in this, right? And that's hard for me personally to spiritually wrestle through that. And that our own community isn't immune to that, right? And how just even locally in our area, we've seen all kinds of things. Maybe you know of someone who's gone through, whether it's abuse, whether it's you've known someone who's been in relationships that they shouldn't have been in. I mean, sexuality finds its way into everyday life for us. And rarely is it finding its way in a healthy way. And it's, I guess if I had to give one overarching theme this morning before we kind of jump into VBJI locally, it's that two things. One, the church and Awaken will not be silent and should not be silent on sexuality. That the church has a responsibility and a voice to speak against evil sexuality and things that don't represent Jesus. And it's unfortunate when the church just wants to speak about positivity and not about truth. And so we want to be a church that speaks about these things and talks about things in an appropriate way. And then two, we want to remember the fact that sexuality was actually created by God for a purpose and a design. And when things are distorted, that's where we see the enemy get the most work in behind the scenes with us. And so this Christians, non-Christians, we're not immune to this concept, right? And so obviously we're having more of a PG-13 related conversation today, which is why we offer great Forge Kids ministry. But the whole idea is that we make sure that we are having appropriate conversations in the right context. I hope that your MCs the next week or two, or the people that you're in relationships with, will have these kind of conversations. I hope you don't avoid them, we should not talk about those kind of things here. But I hope the church is a voice in how we speak about these kind of things. So with that being said, I just want to kind of set the stage for saying we want to talk about this morning. And I'm excited because we, as a church, have been partnering with VBJI now for several years, and we've gotten the unique opportunity to not only have members of our community play huge roles within VBJI, but also we get to kind of celebrate every year. We spend a whole Sunday kind of setting aside a moment to kind of share, and January is Human Trafficking Awareness Month, correct? Yeah, so we want to spend some time, specifically in January, just talking about it. At the end of the service, and I'll say this again, both Faye and Lisa and Lonnie from our community will be at the welcome table talking about some of the next steps. We'll give you guys some opportunities to know what some next steps are for how you want to be involved. But kind of first and foremost, if you guys both wouldn't mind introducing yourself, kind of how long you've been a part of VBJI, and what you're currently doing right now.
Sure. I'm Faye Antizana, and I've been with VBJI for 2.5 to 3 years now, I think. I got involved because my sister dragged me to a meeting, which is how I get involved with a lot of things in my life. But we went to, VBJI has monthly community interest meetings, and she dragged me along with her to one because she didn't want to go by herself. And I had zero interest in getting involved, and then after hearing what they had to say and what the work that they're doing, I thought, you know what, I think I might have been wrong. I think I want to get involved with this. And so I am now the church mobilization coordinator for VBJI, which means I pester good people like you all the time. I'm also a board member, but that's less exciting. So, but we have Lisa just came on board this year, right? Last year.
About a year.
2017.
Yeah, so my name's Lisa Kersey, and God laid this issue on my heart. I don't remember, I heard a story, saw something, a video or something, and was horrified by it. And it just stuck with me for years. And I started researching it, and I was trying to figure out what God wanted me to do about it. And I started giving money through World Vision to sexually exploited children. And I said, but God, there's got to be something closer. Because for most people, when you first learn about human trafficking and sex trafficking, it's something that happens over there, right? It's happening in Thailand, and it's happening, in these other countries. And then if you are paying attention, you find out at some point that it's happening here in the United States, here in Virginia, and right here in Hampton Roads. And that was just a little too much for me. And I thought that maybe God was leading me out of my old job. He was definitely doing that. But I thought maybe this was supposed to be my next job. And everything was kind of far away, and I married. It's just didn't feel like God was leading me there, but those were the jobs I was finding. So I was like, surely I can volunteer somewhere. Somebody's got to be doing something. And then I stumbled across VBJI in my search and saw Faye's face online, and it said Church Mobilization Coordinator, and I thought, perfect. I'll get our church, aligned with this organization, and we'll start to do something and come alongside to help them. And so that's how I ended up at VBJI, and then unbeknownst to me, Faye decided to suggest that I join the board. So I'm a volunteer/board member.
I think one of the things that drew me, like what you were talking about with sexuality, and it's just messy topics, and it's hard. There's not a lot of, tidy little stories like some areas of social justice. If you put a well in, there's a well, and everybody has water, and you move on to the next city, and that's check the box. And that's a great cause, by the way. But human trafficking and anything related to this is kind of a just messy issue, and it's humans you're dealing with, just like in your missional communities. You've got messy, complicated stories and stories of people falling away over and over and over again and coming back. And that's what drew me to it. Is I love a good redemption story. I love a good story of someone whose life has completely fallen apart, coming back around to wholeness and living the life that we all want to be living. So that's my heart connection with this anyway.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, with victims of sex trafficking, you've seen it in some movies and things when they show a quote-unquote a prostitute who has died. It's like, oh, it's just a prostitute. They're seen as forgotten people, as people who aren't worth redeeming, that they made that choice. And one of the things that you learn when you get into this is that pretty much this has not been a choice. I think it's not a choice for anyone. There are people who argue that maybe there's 1% for whom they did choose that. But if you look at the studies and the research on it, one of the biggest reasons that people end up in this place is there's a history of sexual abuse somewhere in their past, physical or sexual abuse. And unfortunately, with sex trafficking, it's all of it. It's physical, it's emotional, and sexual abuse all wrapped into one. And it just felt to me like I can't know that that's happening in my community and not do something. This is sort of the idea of Jesus talked about leaving the 99 to find the one. We're finding lots of ones, lots of ones, which, is good on the one hand, because then we have an opportunity to help. And in many cases, and Lonnie can tell you this as an advocate, many of the clients that we work with will say, no one has ever asked me that question before, or no one has ever tried to help me before. And that just can't happen, as a follower of Jesus.
So one of the things I'd love to just take a moment for is if you guys can kind of give us a real version with some numbers, statistics, things that you guys, perfect, that's very helpful, things that you guys, paint the bigger picture before we get into BBJI, specifically like what you guys have done the last year. I want to hear that story in a second, but people that aren't aware, as you guys just speak to someone who's, maybe there are people here today, and I know I was in this place maybe a year or two ago, had no context of the number of women in Virginia Beach or Hampton Roads or some of the national percentages or numbers. Paint a bigger picture for me, or for everyone here, if you don't mind, and then let's come back and look at some of the specifics that you guys are doing to address some of those things.
Sure. So it's very hard to put numbers and stats on real numbers of how many people are being trafficked because there's a huge issue with identifying victims. And we're starting to see this slowly turn around, but, law enforcement, they don't always, or they haven't always known what to look for. That's starting to change. But we work closely with law enforcement in several of the cities around here, especially in Newport News. They told us several years ago now, and it's only become more apparent. They said we could work on this full time, just out on the streets looking for prostitution and human trafficking, which is basically the same thing. And they said we could dedicate full time to this, and we still wouldn't be able to hit everything. And so we're starting to see, a couple of years ago, it's really become more into the national view lately. But a couple of years ago, people thought, oh, it's taken. It's the people in wherever that was, somewhere in Europe. But we're starting to see it just kind of oozing out of everywhere in the U.S.
So, one of the things, there is actually a whole task force in Las Vegas that's dedicated to this, and then there's a whole team that's on the John side of it, and then there's a whole team that's on the victim side of it. And even they struggle to even, feel like they're scratching the surface. It is happening in every state in the United States. Unfortunately, Virginia, we were a little late to the game. We were the last state in the entire nation to have a law in the books about human trafficking. We now, through a lot of efforts of our executive director and our friends up in Richmond Justice Initiative, have been able to pass 20 laws. Some of those laws are about holding the perpetrators accountable. Some of those laws are about protecting the victims. The one thing that Faye was mentioning, too, with the police and what's hard about the numbers is they're not identified as victims. They're identified as criminals. And that's a big issue that we're trying to work on now, because if you can imagine, I've been victimized. I meet somebody like Lonnie, and I find out that I'm a victim. Like, they don't know. They don't know that they've been victimized. Most of them, they think it's been their fault. That's what they've been told for the longest time, and then they tend to get arrested, and so now they're a criminal. And now I find out I'm a victim and I'm a criminal. One of those by itself would be kind of hard to process through, and they have to process through both of those. And so one of the things we're trying to do is work with our legislators to look at opportunities for expunging the records of victims where their crimes are linked to their abuse, essentially. These aren't crimes that they would have just, committed on their own. Because, as you imagine, if I've been arrested and then I'm hooked up with somebody like Lonnie and I'm going through and trying to go through a healing process, and then eventually, we're trying to get them to self-sufficiency, not apart from Jesus, of course, but in the sense of being able to be employed and have a place to live on their own and not just in a shelter anymore. And so as we move them on that journey, if you've got a criminal record, it's really hard to get a place to live or to get a job. And so we're working to try to do that. So as you can tell, this is a very, these women go, and there are men too, but most the ones we're dealing right now with are women. And they really have been dealt some complex trauma that we need to work through with them. And the other thing to know is that the faces of victims might surprise you. So you hear about child sex trafficking, and that certainly is very real. And they start, they like to start them as young as 14, and there's certainly around the world kids who are traded who are younger than that. But the average age in our country is about 14. But there are women still being trafficked up into their 40s and 50s. We've met women in jail programs who listen to what we share, and they say, "You just told my story. I didn't realize there was a name for what happened to me." And that's just heartbreaking to me, that an adult woman like that has no idea that that's what's happened to her. So it really does span the gamut.
And I think that's where we're talking about the messiness of people's stories, is a lot of these people are either force addicted by their traffickers to drugs, or they turn to that as a coping mechanism, or they've gotten involved with any number of, criminal issues that go along with being on that side of life, honestly. And so there's a whole lot, aside from the entire, one thing of being victimized and being a criminal is totally enough to throw someone's life out of whack. But then they have this host of other issues that need to be worked through as well.
So you guys were with us actually in the theater last year. We've since moved, obviously. Feels so long ago that we were in the theater. But last year, you guys were talking about a lot of great things that you were doing. So in the last 12 months, kind of give us an update of where you guys have been, what's been going on. I know there are some helpful things here. You guys are in jails now, over 50 clients you've worked with, starting to open a home called Restoring Hope, which speaks to some of the not being able to get housing and things like that. So tell me about some of the things that we're doing locally that you guys are doing.
Yeah, actually, if you told me this when I was here last year, or at the theater last year, I would have fallen off my chair or thought, that's not going to happen. But so when we started last year, we had pretty much just really gotten our footing with a jail program, which is a curriculum that some of our advocates and staff put together to explain human trafficking. Lonnie's one of the instructors, so she's got all kinds of information on that if you're interested in learning more about it. But it basically teaches these women what trafficking is, what the signs are, and that's leading a lot of them. That's what Lisa was talking about, where they say, "Oh, I think that's my story. That's what's happened to me." And so we started out in one jail last year. By the end of the year, we're in 3 and working on a 4th. And so our goal is to be in all of the local jails, which is, I think that might be the last one. But anyway, and so we're really excited about that. We've got several instructors working in each one, and through that program, and as well as the survivors we're already working with, we are working with over 50 survivors this year, or over 40 to 50. And last year, I think when we started, we had something like 12. So this has been a huge just influx of people coming in, which is a blessing because that's what we're here for. That's what we're looking for. That's a whole lot of missing ones. And so with that comes a huge need for additional advocates and people to come alongside them. And so our last advocacy class, which we've got information on as well, was the largest one yet, but we're still got a huge need for that. And you want to talk about Prevention Project?
Oh, yeah. So in addition to our advocacy program, and we have another training coming up in April if anybody's interested in following in Lonnie's footsteps, you can see that there's a need for them. The other thing we do is prevention. So, not only do we want to help those who have already fallen into to sex trafficking, but we want to try to prevent kids from ever falling into that. And so there's a curriculum that was put together with educators, law enforcement, social workers, multidisciplinary group of people, actually out of Richmond. And it started there, and they're now in like 7 states, I think. And multiple schools, and over 100,000 kids who now have been taught about what this looks like. And the idea is to empower these kids to understand A, that it exists, B, what to look for themselves, but also to be looking out for their friends. And there's an element to the project that at the end there's an application. So there's a chance for these kids, based on what they've learned, to apply what they've learned. And they're very creative, as you might imagine. So there's kids who have created, videos. There's kids who have done a whole PR program at their schools and dedicated a night of a football game to talking about it, and where everybody wears a band, and just really to help raise that awareness. There's one young man on the peninsula, out of Smithfield. He's since graduated, but he was a senior, and he went through the program, and he happened to have some really amazing IT skills. And he developed a program that would go online, because he realized part of the problem is if there wasn't any demand, then we wouldn't have this issue. And he felt like, as a man, that's kind of the perspective he brought to it, that he wanted to stop the demand for it. Wanted to find people where they were online, which is where a lot of it happens, and the behaviors they're getting into and starting to buy people online. And they've started to see them as products. And so he wanted to unmask that. And he turns this project in, and his teacher thought, well, this is kind of amazing, but I'm not really sure it's like it can do what he says it can do. So he sent it over to some connections he had at the city, and he said, hey, will you take a look at this? And they called him immediately, and they said, my goodness, this needs to be in the hands of law enforcement. So it's now being used. What this kid developed is being used to help law enforcement, take the, because when men go online like that to buy, it's all hidden, right? So nobody has to know. They go to work during the day. Nobody knows the difference. And those people look like everybody. That does not have a specific profile. It could be anybody. And they can now find out who those people are, and they can intercede before that sale happens. So, never doubt what one person can do or what a child can do. And so we really want to bring that to as many schools as possible. It's in Newport News, actually, this year. It started as a high school curriculum, and they decided, if the kids are younger when this starts, and given what we know kids at younger ages know these days, we should maybe start there. And so a middle school curriculum was created, and it's in all of the middle schools in Newport News now. And we've had some initial discussions with Virginia Beach schools. And other schools are starting to do things, because on the legislative push that we had a few years ago, there's things coming down, but it's sort of in pieces, and we want to try to give them as comprehensive a program as we can, because we see this program making a difference for these kids.
So we've only got a couple minutes left. Tell me, whether it's myself or our community at large or individually, how can Awaken Church continue to partner with you guys? What are some of the next steps? I know you've just already spoken some to the jail piece. I'm sure that's part of it. The class coming up in April. I know you have all this material at our Welcome Center, and then obviously Lonnie's a local huge door opener for us here. But speak to what are the next steps for us, for people who want to be involved and connected?
So the next thing coming up is our next advocacy training course. Starts on April 9th, correct? And we have information out here for that if anyone's interested in signing up. Even if you don't know if you can be an active advocate, I would encourage you to take that class. You learn just a ton. It was incredibly helpful for me just in kind of empathizing with these victims and figuring out not exactly, but more of a picture of what's going on in their psyches and the trauma that they've been through. And we, of course, do have a huge need for new advocates to help with all of these new victims that are coming through that we want to walk through with to being survivors. We also have our 5K coming up on April 21st. I don't know why those dates just fell right out of my head. But you guys are, I think, supplying a bounce houses for us, and so you'll have some people out there. We've been talking to Jeff. But we want as many people as possible to come out and sign up to run, sign up to fundraise for it. It's really easy to do online. We've got information about that too. And then on your way out, we have little magnets and cards that you can take home and stick on your fridge that just list a couple of more options. If none of those seem like the right fit and you want to get involved, there's plenty of things that you can do.
Awesome. Well, what I want to do is pray for you guys and pray for this ongoing issue, obviously, in our country, but also locally. As the band gets ready to come up, I just want to speak to it kind of, again, from a church perspective for us. This is not a once-a-year thing that we do. This is a constant thing that we do, right? And it's one of those things that we want to be a voice in. This is an awkward, potentially, week for us to go right from talking about interview style, some pretty different topics, right, sexuality, to moving into a time of worship. But what I want to propose to you is something different today, that as we respond in worship, because we believe that worship is truly something that we all partake in, that it's participatory, I can never say that word right, and how we work together as a community. And what I would ask is that you would respond to the stations today with this context in mind. So if there's someone on your heart specifically that you know that's been associated with this, or you just simply want to write BBJI on a sticky note today and put it on the cross as your way of saying, Lord, I don't know what my next step is. Maybe today was just simply hearing and raising my awareness, but I want to become a prayer warrior for this. So maybe that's the first step that you do, and that's your way of putting this before the Lord on the cross. Or maybe there's a person or a situation or something that God has put in your heart that you want to have it left at the foot of the cross today. So that would be our first suggestion for you this morning. If you're like me this morning, I think we all have an opportunity of confession, right? We as the church, Big C Church globally, have not always been a voice, but definitely not the leading voice on this. And so just as an act of just a reminder, maybe there's a piece of ownership that you feel, or maybe it's just simply you saying, Lord, moving forward, I want to confess that I want to be more a part of something like this, or I just want you for you to know that my heart aches for this as well. I want my heart to ache the way that your heart aches for this, Lord. And so the confession table with the stone washing is there for you as well. And then finally, I think the biggest banner reminder for us today is that Jesus is king, right? He's king over this. He's king over sexuality, and he's sovereign. And despite the evilness in the world today, Jesus is still king. And we're reminded about that by what Jesus did on the cross. And so we have the communion table available for us to be reminded that he conquered sexuality and sin on the cross for when it's taken outside of the context he created it in. And so we get to raise that banner together as a church and sing these songs, not just simply as like an act of what we're supposed to do as Christians, but because we believe in the one who can change all of this, the one who can not just simply make it better, but transform things. And he did that by conquering on the cross as a reminder to us. So I pray that as we get ready to lead in this moment of worship, that it's not just simply words on a screen for us, but that we can tie these two worlds together, because they're actually not disconnected. They're deeply connected, because Jesus deeply cares about this. And we're going to submit our lives and our desires and our vision for us as a church, and also our partnership with VBJI under that banner that Jesus is king. And as we go forward, I would ask you would pray with us. So let's actually stand, if you will. We'll get ready to worship, and then I'll pray. Father, I thank you right now just for everything that you're doing, for the opportunities, God, that we have to be a part of VBJI, a part of this awareness that we're raising. God, thank you for my sisters here, and obviously the numerous other advocates, leaders. God, I pray for the people that in 2018 will not only discover greater awareness, but that will come to meet Jesus for the first time, that will begin to learn what true forgiveness looks like, and that will figure out what it means to be sustainable. God, I pray for your power and your strength in the school systems, in these jails, in the legislative systems, God. God, I pray that within our own community, God, you would continue, God, to convict and challenge us in ways that we can work together. And God, I thank you so much. There are people who care enough about your people that were created in your image, that are no more or less human than each of us in this room. God, that you've created them, you love them, you care for them. And God, today we celebrate that you've created them, and we're reminded that we all submit our lives under you as our King. God, as we leave this place, as we enter into a time of worship, God, would you keep this fresh on our heart? Would you begin to remove the calluses off our hearts where we become numb and desensitized to what the world is going on with sexuality, and that we as the church and that we as Awakened Church would be a part of a leading voice in this. We pray all this in Jesus' name. And everyone said, amen. Let's worship.